So we've got two more speakers who've recently published very important books in this area. We've got Nick Bano, here, who is the author of Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis, published by Verso, and Jacob Stringer, author of Renters Unite, How Tenants' Unions Are Fighting the Housing Crisis, published by Pluto. Can really recommend both books. And I think Nick's going to go first.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. As well as having the book out, my day job, my main job is being a housing rights lawyer. And if you'll forgive me for starting with something of a war story on that front, but there was a case I did the other day that's really got under my skin. It was a garden variety private landlord dispute. We had a small amount of arrears, 2 or 3 grand, and we defended it with a damp and mould counterclaim. And not to blow my own trumpet, but we smashed it. We got about £35,000 in damages, which more than eliminated the arrears. And the judge evicted us anyway for breach of tenancy because some of the damage to the decoration was the tenant's fault. Now, the judge found that the property had never been fit for human habitation because there were leaks from the outset and terrible, terrible damp and mould. But the tenants had caused a small amount of damage, and I've got some quotes from her here. There was a lack of care on the part of the tenants and their children, one of whom I add was autistic. Over sustained periods, they have been in breach of their obligations regarding maintenance and decoration. And she said that they'd shown no contrition. And this, for me, is the legacy of the assured short-hold tenancy regime, the 1988 Act. We've heard a lot about how there's no magic bullets. Well, for the landlords there was, and it was the 1988 Act. And what it's caused over the last 30 or 40 years is this idea that we've come to treat tenancies and tenants as entirely disposable things, whereas homes, even those homes which are unfit for human habitation, are assets that must be protected. And the way I think this works is that legislation is in conversation with society. They speak to each other. Sometimes legislation reflects social values. Sometimes legislation changes social values. And this, I think, is caused to change. And it's obvious because part of my job is looking at the old judicial decisions from before the 1988 Act, when judges who are more or less representative of society used to think that it was outrageous, the idea that you might evict an elderly person or children, and they now do it at the drop of a hat. To them now, an eviction is nothing. It doesn't touch the sides. And what they're doing is they're beaming back to us this ideology that was created by statute and then has arisen in the kind of soil that the statute has created. Now, attitudes to landlords are very, very different as they were in the 70s and 80s, as is attitudes to homelessness, as are attitudes to evictions and children. So we're now in a situation where our reality is, of course, it's the tenant's job to look after the asset. Of course, it's entirely fair and reasonable that deposits should be taken away to pay for a deep clean, a service that the landlord provides to the next tenant. And tenancies, our homes, have become entirely disposable. And the other side of that coin is that, of course, it's not the landlord's job to carry out repairs. We live in a world in which damp and mould are rife, in which a huge proportion of the sector is in disrepair, and we simply don't expect landlords to do the most basic work anymore, whereas we do expect tenants to look after their assets. And this isn't a reflection necessarily of weak tenant power, of a weak movement. It's simply a reflection of the conditions that the legislation caused, the bargaining power that created. And the question for us today, the title of this session, is how we rebuild, how we take that back from landlords. And it couldn't be a more exciting time because the Renters' Rights Act finally got royal assent last month and is coming in May. I think it is something of a silver bullet because it's going to bring back for the first time security of tenure since the 1988 Act came in. I'm trying to correct the idea in my head that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you're a lawyer, you see legal fixes for everything, and it's difficult not to get excited about a new piece of legislation. For me, it's Christmas come early. But what I'm interested in is not the law itself, not what the statute says, but how that's going to affect social behaviours. Because we've seen this for the 88 Act. You pass a statute, and 40 years later, you evict a tenant for damaging the hall wallpaper. How is this Act going to change our behaviour over the next few years? How will these new rules lead to new social behaviours and reform or remake our ideology? And most importantly, how does the movement take advantage of this, take control of this and steer it? The main criticism of the new Act is that it doesn't really say anything about making renting more affordable. The cost of renting is the whole point of the rule of rentiers. And the Act itself, it's true, doesn't on its face do anything to fix that. There's no formal rent control. There's a very, very weak reintroduction of a kind of rent regulation which in fact has always been in place, but for years landlords have been able to get around. But what I'm interested in is how the legislation is going to pan out in the real world. How does this refixation of relative bargaining positions look in 5-10 years' time? When you think through the likely or possible consequences, the changes could be very, very dramatic indeed. Last week we had the Housing Lawyers Annual Conference. It's a much more exciting gathering than its title would sound, but we were strategising how we're going to do this and what it's going to look like in 5 years' time. And the way it looks like is this. Come May, landlords won't be able to raise the rent in the usual way, which at the moment is by sending an email, by issuing a new tenancy, by WhatsApping, by ringing you up and saying the rent's going up, just demanding a new rent. Come May, the only way to raise the rent will be serving a statutory notice, which we can challenge in the tribunal. Now, it's true that the tribunal can only fix it at the market rent, but there is absolutely no disincentive to every single tenant challenging every single rent increase. Because the way that the law works is when you challenge it, the rent increase is paused. It doesn't come into effect until the tribunal decides it. So you have the absolute advantage that your old rent will continue in effect for that period of time. When you challenge it, even if you lose, it can't go up any more than what the landlord has asked for. So there's really there's no disincentive to doing this. We don't know how long it's going to take for the tribunals to decide these cases. They're recruiting 40 new tribunal judges, but even so, there are literally millions of tenants. And if every single one of them challenges every single rent increase, then this movement has got the landlords over a barrel. Even if we lose every single case, what we've done is made it an automatic, standardised part of our practice to challenge a rent increase in the tribunal whenever it's proposed. It's not legally difficult. No one has to go to court. It's not a highly skilled job. It's really a form-filling exercise. It's very, very suitable for renters' unions to take up as part of the peer support that they provide to their members. Part of the mutual aid. Whenever you get a rent increase, your branch is going to sit down and help you fill in the forms. So this, I think, is what the movement is likely going to be doing over the next few years. I'm glad that Wandsworth Council is going to be helping out too. But it's an opportunity that we've not had since the 80s to interrupt and slow down and question the automatic rent-raising power of the landlord class. But the fun doesn't stop there, because the question is going to be how this pans out in the day-to-day world. And probably, when this beds in, landlords and tenants will start cutting a deal with each other, particularly if the tribunal is overwhelmed. So in, say, 2 or 3 years' time, you'll have this annual conversation where the landlord says, listen, Foxtons tell me I can get a 15% rent increase. Why don't we call it 10 and you promise not to go to the tribunal? The renters' union will say, well, this is our member. We're very angry and powerful. How about 1%? How about 0.5%? How about a rent reduction because the boiler's broken? And we'll settle on something like 1 or 2. Now, that's a brilliantly useful role that the movement can and will play. And it has knock-on benefits, because the cases that don't settle and go to the tribunal, the question for the tribunal will be, well, what's the current market rent? And that's judged by looking at recently agreed rents. So if you've just agreed a 2% rent increase for your member, you've helped everyone else in the street who goes to the tribunal. So by agreeing to these lower rent increases, the movement will be contributing to lower awards in the tribunal, deflating or at least reducing the inflation of market rents. And the role of the tenant movement is going to make sure that we're helping each other with these challenges. In addition to that, my standing advice to everyone who comes to me at the moment is wait until May and then sue your landlord. Everyone's got a problem with their home. And one of the things that lawyers have been quietly doing in the last few years is establishing some mild precedents that say breach of the fitness for human habitation provisions can equal 100% of the rent. So once you can no longer be evicted for taking your landlord to court, you sue them and you see how much rent you can get back. There are also very, very valuable claims you can bring against your landlord for example, lying about the reason for evicting you. If they get a possession order and they've lied about it, cases suggest you could sue them for sort of 6 figures. So they're facing the sort of financially ruinous prospects that they simply have not had to worry about since the 1980s. And the potential is huge, and the question is how we take advantage of it, how we get ourselves organised. I come from the kind of now formalised legal aid world. It's a remnant of the old welfare state. And it was the nice idea that the government had after the war of funding a form of social assistance, which is great when the government is feeling lavish. And Keir Starmer made loads and loads of money out of being a legal aid lawyer in the 1990s. But when you come to austerity, you come to find out that the state can stop being generous. What the system currently does is we've made ourselves beholden to the state. We've made ourselves beholden to Rachel Reeves and her successors. And one of the things that was noticeable after Grenfell, I did some volunteering there, was that people were very, very suspicious of the local law centre because of the cosy role it had with the local state. Of course, the lawyers were formally independent. And of course, it spent most of its time suing Kensington and Chelsea, but it was a fact that local law centres rely on the public purse to survive. And I don't for a minute blame people for being wary of the state funding with one hand and killing with the other. So we might want to think about better models for social assistance for tenants. If we look at, for example, Germany at the end of the 19th century, they had a system of workers' offices which were sort of mutual assistance, trade union type schemes, which were incredibly political and totally independent of external funding. And that's the sort of thing that we could try to replicate now that we have to rebuild the legal aid system from scratch because it's been cut to the bone. There's old 1960s documentaries of the original sort of movement lawyers who built this in the first place, and their vision was to set up in butcher shops and back streets. And there's great footage of these kind of guys like smoking pipes and their kind of elaborate scarves and hats saying, you know, it's terrible that people call me sir. And that kind of, the language has changed, but that kind of division of service provision and renter hasn't really gone away. And I think if we want to start again as a movement, we could think about how we do that in a much, much more integrated and political way. So we're not just challenging things case by case. We're not just filtering things through the legal channels that the state likes us to do, but taking on big policy campaigns, folding that in to political campaigns, and not just having lawyers as an adjunct to whatever the politics are doing. So my small demand for the movement is challenge every single rent increase every single year. That's very, very achievable. My big suggestion is that we start again with our whole idea of what social support looks like as a feature of resisting rentierism. The state has a very, very different concept of what change is going to look like post Renters' Rights Act. And the state's noticed that no one is in charge of the private rented sector. The role of policing it falls partly to tenants and partly to local councils, neither of whom really do. What the government is doing is it's changing that in the Act by, for the first time, putting a duty on local authorities to actually enforce on landlords in their area. At the moment, it's entirely up to them, and they don't because they can't afford it. And this government wants to force them to do it. And in principle, it's a nice idea because it could be entirely self-funding. Local authorities could turn up and issue on-the-spot fines of many, many thousands of pounds if, for example, they find a Category 1 hazard in a home. And those fines would pay for the staff who are issuing them. So an ambitious and committed local authority could do this at virtually zero cost to itself. At the moment, it feels a bit unrealistic. There was a case recently against Cardiff Council where it was revealed that Cardiff hadn't prosecuted a single landlord in years. And the reason why is because there used to be a guy at the council whose job it was, and he knew how to do it, but he left and he wasn't replaced. So no one at the council knew how to prosecute a case. And that's not uncommon. So local councils are on the back foot. But the renters' movement isn't. The renters' movement's been growing in strength and it's been growing in experience. So if anyone's going to stand up to landlords, it's going to be this tenant movement, which is now armed with this powerful tool of security of tenure. I feel it's been far too upbeat to talk so far, so I'm going to break with tradition and round off with a note of pessimism. I don't want you all thinking that I'm full of hope. The panel is about the rule of rentiers, and I think it's worth thinking for a minute about what that means, and particularly building on the first panel this morning about hegemony. One of the things that I've been trying to point out in the last few years is the right-wing arguments against landlordism, the idea that left and right should have the same natural enemy. Because if you're on the right and you want lower taxes, if you want a lower wage bill and a higher profit margin, a large and expensive private rented sector makes absolutely no sense. A system of runaway rents is bad for everyone. See Adam Smith. And I think the reason why this argument is falling on barren soil is that it's no longer true for reasons that Jeremy alluded to this morning. I think this was widely understood in the 1970s that landlords were a drag on the economy. They were just skimming off the social surplus. And that's true when you've got a small rented sector. It's fine to attack landlords, but things are very, very different now. The key argument that I'm making against landlords is that the private rented sector is the ultimate determiner of house prices, because a home can never fall below the price that the average landlord would be willing to pay. And when you have a system of constantly increasing rents, it's landlordism which is driving up the cost of all housing, which means that there's two problems with attacking that system of landlordism. First, and this was said earlier as well today, that house prices are the backbone of the national economy. They're a stand-in for poor wages, they're a stand-in for poor pensions, they're a stand-in for a crumbling social state. And if you take that away from households, that's financially ruinous for a plurality of people. And the second is that, as was also mentioned, a huge part of the financial services sector is based on mortgage debt. So the financial services sector, which again is the national economy, is totally dependent on the value of housing. So the economic function of the landlord has been transformed over the last 40 years from being a totally unproductive class, indeed an anti-productive class, to being a key plank of the national economy more broadly today. They play a very, very important economic role in the whole economy. That's not to say they're not our enemy. Of course they're our enemy. I just want to point out how outrageous it is that we've been put into this position where we're fighting effectively a civil war, an economic civil war, just in order to be able to house and feed ourselves. So in the next few years, when we're resisting the rule of rentiers by challenging every single rent increase, we are also attacking finance capital, necessarily. We are also attacking the personal wealth of the plurality of households in this country, because home ownership is still the biggest form of tenure. It's not our fault that we've been put in this position. There really is a rule of rentiers, but those rentiers are in this weird coalition with homeowners and with anyone who has a stake in the national economy more broadly. So we've got an exciting few years ahead of us. There is absolutely no doubt that the renters' movement is going to start gaining ground from day one. Come May, landlords will not know what's hit them. And although that family got evicted, that landlord has still got to pay £35,000, which is something of a win. So, disrepair claims, rent challenges, you can't touch me, my tenancy's safe, and I've got the union behind me. We're going to kick them while they're down, and we're going to keep on finding new ways of kicking them every day. And with that, I'll pass over.
Thanks. Wow. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I'm Jacob. I wrote Renters Unite, a book about the new wave of tenant organising across the global north, partly because I was in a tenant union and I was excited by it, partly because I ended up also researching the tenant union, But also because it captured a particular political moment, which is still happening. This is a moment when a lot of people's, for a lot of people, the biggest problem in their life is their housing. It's where they feel the most exploited. They might even feel more exploited by their landlord than by their boss. And in fact, their landlord may well take much more of their money than their boss is taking in profit from their labour. We've talked a lot about this thing called housing crisis today. Like a lot of people who think about that term, I ended up challenging it in the book and, well, this is a weird term, isn't it? A crisis is something that kind of happens by accident. It usually lasts quite a short amount of time and then you deal with it, right? But clearly that's not what's going on. Instead, governments consistently implement policies that make housing worse for people. So the moment has consisted of this time when lots of people are suddenly living in unaffordable housing, getting ridiculous rent rises, terrible conditions, just their whole lives destabilised. By the way, like if you're a single person in the private rented sector and you think it sucks, you should try being a family in the private rented sector, because like your kid's nursery is just down the road, and if you get evicted, you won't be able to find another place you can afford in the area, and you have to move to another area, and that means moving your kid from one nursery to another, which is not a small thing, and the same with schooling and so on. So this moment where people's housing has come to suck more and more has converged with actually a moment on the left where people have been thinking about increasing the size of organising, doing big organising. The reason they've been thinking about that is essentially the sort of decline of the trade union movement to quite a large extent. But also an understanding that this growing inequality in society is not going to stop. We haven't really addressed this a lot today, but just to say that inequality is essentially at the root of a lot of the problems we've been talking about here. Like the housing crisis is an inequality problem, right? And you know, we live in this age where billionaires own more than, you know, a handful of billionaires own more than 50% of the population. And this is also part of what's driving all the way finances are working and what's happening to wages and everything. So the trade union movement, despite the new pressures on people working terrible jobs in service industries and so on, very precarious jobs often, the labour movement has not entirely managed to resurrect itself. And that's left a lot of people on the left sitting around thinking, well, how do we organise people? We need solidarity. That's the lifeblood of the left. Where are we going to find solidarity? And so the housing crisis, as we call it, has converged with this moment of lots of people going, we really need big organising. We really want to take on the people in power. We really need to take on the power of capital. And, you know, this is reflected in my journey somewhat. I've been involved in political activity of some kind for most of my adult life. And I used to be just involved in quite small groups, either like small specific activist groups or little local organising groups trying to get a specific thing from the council or something like that. And it came to seem to me that like this just wasn't going to cut it, right? That we needed something bigger. And tenant unions are in part an answer to that problem. How do we organise in a society where workplace organising doesn't seem like it's going to revive itself in the near future? How do we organise ourselves where people live? And this is a really key part of tenant unionism, is thinking about where people live, the fact that at the moment a lot of people don't know their neighbours, and thinking about the fact that the diversity of society, particularly in London, where I've been organising with the London Renters Union, the diversity is visible on the street, but you don't actually necessarily know people from different backgrounds. You don't necessarily know people from different economic stratas. Life tends to be very stratified indeed. And that's very difficult ground for establishing, the idea of solidarity, let alone the practicality of it. So London Renters Union was born, but it was also part of a wave of tenant unions that was born across the UK, across Europe, across North America, across a lot of the world. In answer to the question of what are we going to do about housing. And it's, for me, it was a very new experience, right? And I look back on my previous political organising and think it wasn't so successful. And then I think about London Renters Union branch meeting, right? So a tenant union is organised into branches around local areas. And a branch is a community of people that stand in solidarity with each other. That's what a tenant union is at its heart. And yes, you're addressing particular housing disputes, a landlord putting up rent too much, not doing repairs, and so on. And you're working on that together. But it's always about building a sort of wider solidarity, drawing in people who are often just really isolated in their lives. And this is something, it's quite sad, the discovery sometimes, that someone's just been struggling with their housing problem alone for 2 years, and then suddenly they encounter the tenant union, and their life changes because they understand, well, no, I couldn't win my dispute alone, but with people at my side, willing to stand in solidarity, I can win it. And that is transformative for people who come into London Renters Union. So I would encourage you, if you live in London, join LRU. You can join if you are a homeowner. You can join as a solidarity member. You can't join if you're a landlord. Sorry. Not sorry. So, because what it will give you is experience of solidarity in the place where you live. And I think this is something that so few people have experienced in our society. It's just quite a rare thing. And it just often feels beautiful. And it's been, I would say, a life-changing experience for me, getting to know types of people that I'd never encountered before, watching people's lives change as they understand that the act of solidarity really can help them. And it takes you out of your comfort zone, right? And I think it's important to get out of that comfort zone. We have the freedom to choose our friends in this society, which is very nice, but we end up just choosing people like us, right? So it's actually a really transformative experience to be to choose to organise with people who are just entirely unlike yourself. And of course, people come into a tenant union who have different political views to you. And you have to deal with that. And it's not like arguing with someone online where you can just tell them that they're wrong and then block them. You're going to have a relationship with this person, right? And they think immigrants are to blame for the housing crisis. a not uncommon view, right? Of course, people who have that view are going to join your tenant union if you are doing large-scale organising. So you're going to have to learn how to talk to them about that without shaming them and without like making them feel bad so they just walk out the door. And it's like, you know, it's difficult work, but it's also like really rewarding work. And this is where like political solidarity is built. Okay. As I say, this has been a kind of global moment. London Renters Union was not the first tenant union like this, and many have come after. There are new tenant unions being built around the country now, some of them quite small, but they're just getting going. And there's this anger to be tapped into, right? Because people are pissed off about their housing, right? They understand that it doesn't have to be like this. They know that within living memory, it was not like this. So the political moment has created this beautiful sort of synchronous moment of tenant organising arising all over the place, driven by this anger, driven by people's belief that in the end they can have a better life, they can have decent housing, and still have some money left over to spend at the end of it. There are real challenges to this tenant organising. As I say, the idea with tenant organising is always to go big, build a big tenant union. I would say we're not big enough yet. We need to get bigger. And when I talk to tenant unions, I talk a bit more about that and about like perhaps the barriers to getting bigger and so on, but I think this isn't quite the space for it. But there's an understanding among, you know, most people in tenant unions that ideally they would be 10 times, 100 times the size that they are. So there's still a lot of building to be done. There's also a problem that's been alluded to a bit here, which is that we're quite an unusual country here in the sheer number of landlords we have. Something that wasn't mentioned much in the discussions of the catastrophe that's happened to housing is the buy-to-let mortgage in this country. And it's done two things. It has put up house prices. Anytime you make more financing available to buy houses, you put up house prices. I wish any mainstream journalist who talks about housing could understand that simple idea, but they don't. Anyway, so buy-to-let mortgages put up house prices. But it's also democratized, not in a good sense of the term, landlordship in this country. And there are around 2 million landlords. And that's quite unusual. On the global scene, it's quite unusual to have that higher number of landlords. It does mean that when you propose rent controls, even if half of the landlords agree you should have it, there's still 1 million people who really, really hate the idea and are going to fight you every step of the way. So it's sort of in some ways a unique landscape to be fighting in. And ultimately, I think some of what Beth was talking about with rent controls and so on, and actually gradually nudging landlords out of the market is a very fruitful way to go, because we really need less landlords in this country. Of course, as well as all the individual landlords in this country who dominate the rental market here, we've now got a lot more of BlackRock and so on coming in, and they've got the ear of government. And this iteration of the Labour Party in Westminster genuinely believes that BlackRock can help them solve the housing crisis, which is just such a total failure to understand the incentives involved that I don't even know where to start. So we've really got to make it clear to any government that comes in that the housing we need is truly affordable housing, is social housing. Some people talk about another term rather than NIMBY and YIMBY being a FIMBY, public housing in my backyard. And we've got to get that built, and the funding for it does have to be unlocked at Westminster at this point. So that is something that in this country tenant unions really have to grasp and push for change there. I guess this is an obvious point to make after everything that's been said here as well, but when tenant unionists first start out, when they first join the tenant union, they think, oh, we're fighting the landlords. That's quite a powerful block. It's going to be quite a difficult fight. God, I really hope we can win. And then as their political education improves, they actually come to understand, oh, we're not just fighting the landlords, are we? We're fighting this vast block of capital that's a key part of the financial system. And that's an even bigger task. That is like a truly massive challenge. And so the obvious conclusion you have to draw from that is that tenant unions can't really win the fight alone. They have to be in political alliance with a broad range of political forces across society. Ultimately, they will have to get parties on side and bring the power of the state to bear. And that feels a long way away in some ways now, because we've got this, terrible version of Labour in Westminster, but at the same time, the two-party system we've had for a long time is kind of falling apart, and there are potentially new openings there. On that topic, I just want to mention a sort of what to me is an important thing I think about now as reform is on the rise, and seeing this really hard right politics being mainstreamed in a lot of ways. That this extra parliamentary organising at community level just becomes even more important, right? And it's important not just because of housing, but because you don't want people to be strangers to their neighbours. You don't want people to see the migrant next door as an other. You want them to see them as a fellow tenant unionist, or at least someone who will stand in solidarity with them in some way. The far right, of course, claim that they have the solutions to the problems that beset British society. It's funny, they never really talk about housing, though, do they? And I suspect that, we could find that most of the people with power in reform are landlords. So that's probably no coincidence. But we're not going to just defeat reform with arguments, right? It's not going to happen. We need to build community. We need to help people understand that they have more in common with the people who live around them or with the people who live in the next town than they do with Nigel Farage, who supposedly wants to disrupt the status quo. Tenant unions are not the whole of the problem, not the whole of the solution to the reform problem, but I think they can be a big part of the solution if we make them big enough and bold enough and get enough people together to create a new housing future.
Okay, great. So we've got a question. I'll take this one first.
Thanks to both of the speakers. We've heard a couple of times today people saying, oh, why don't we have a big enough renters movement? Why don't we have a sort of sexy comms campaign all around rent controls? Well, something that London Renters Union, Greater Manchester Tenants Union, Acorn all have in common is that those organisations are all part of something called the Homes for Us Alliance, which some of you might not have heard of. This is a sort of coalition of organisations that was originally started by the New Economics Foundation and is facilitated by them, but is run by an organising committee of people from those organisations, including myself. My name's Jackson. I work for Harrow Law Centre in North West London. Isaac, who we heard from earlier, is also on that organising committee. We bring different bits of the movement together, not just organisations that focus exclusively on housing, but disabled people's organisations, migrant justice organisations, to build the big coalition that we need to get to grips with some of the issues that we've been talking about today. And we've got a big strategic focus on rent controls at the moment. So that's going to be our focus in 2026. That's also a big strategic focus of London Renters Union. So you should be hearing a lot about rent controls next year. We should, get those viral TikTok videos about rent controls if we do our jobs right next year. There should be a big demo for rent controls and more investment in social housing in spring of next year. And it's quite an exciting initiative. So if anyone is in this room is a member of some kind of charity, tenants union, campaigning organisation, and you haven't heard of Homes for Us, or you're not sure if your organisation is a member of that coalition, please come and speak to me and we can exchange details.
Hi. I'm a trade unionist, I'm a workplace organiser. So, yeah, kind of out about what you're saying, but fair enough. How do you think that trade unions could support both of you in your work? And I guess on the other side of things, I'm running for council as well. How do you think that councils could support you in your work? It's not about the council taking over the work, it's you as a separate organisation doing the work. How can these two bodies support the work that you're doing?
Okay, great question. Let's see what you both think.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit sad because for years since the newer tenant unions have started up, there's been a lot of talk about working with trade unions and trying to build coalitions with trade unions, and it's a little sad that it hasn't happened yet. I do think more efforts need to be made on both sides. Trade unions they do some campaigns outside of the workplace, but they're perhaps not used to thinking very much about their members' lives when they go home. And I think an expansion of thinking would be helpful there, and thinking about, well, we can win them, maximum 10% wage rise here, but if we could cut their rent, actually they would have more money. So I think both sides need to work on this. I think also tenant unions, because it's quite a lot of work running a tenant union, sometimes it's difficult to be putting out the feelers to other left-wing movement organisations to build those alliances, and I think more efforts do need to be made. On the issue of what councils can do, I think Aidan was talking about some of it. They just really need to maximise the use of their powers. Most councils are not at all. There are various enforcement powers that councils have. Most councils don't use those or don't use them enough. And why is this not a priority? Well, because the councils have hundreds of other priorities, but people's living conditions are pretty important. So that would be the main ask I would have right now.
Thanks. looking more at the council's question than the trade union question, if I were running a council and I was sitting down with Steve Reed, the first question I would ask him is, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? Because it seems to me that you probably can't. But the second question I'd ask him is, why on earth are you not capping the rents on temporary homelessness accommodation? Eastbourne Council spends 50% of its entire budget on temporary homelessness accommodation. It goes back to what Jeremy was saying earlier about privatising water. Of course government can do it, and if it controlled the prices of public sector spending, you would slash local government spending, you would stop incentivising landlords from being temporary accommodation providers, and you would force them back into becoming ordinary private sector landlords, which would reduce the amount of homelessness to begin with and lessen the burden on homelessness services. So it seems to me to be a no-brainer.
Okay, great, thanks. Hang on, I saw there was someone else before you. Hang on, I'll go to you.
Okay, I'll follow that actually. I really like your argument, Nick, in your book, and a great book, that rents control house prices. And I had that experience trying to sell my mother's flat a few years ago. Constantly gazumped by people. I got an offer for someone who wanted to live there, and it was gazumped by somebody who wanted to rent it out. It happened several times. But I'm really struck by the fact it was talked about Beth's bit about the CMA, that even if they build all this housing, we'll only get 1% removed from the house prices. The OBR in the spring, they said a similar thing. It was in the middle of that OBR report. Now, and I tried to get that in the Standard, and the editor of the Standard said, no, that can't be right. It can't be right. If you build 1.5 million, surely supply and demand, it can't possibly be right. You're wrong. Chook, put the phone down. It was extraordinary. And it begs the question to me, do they really want to know? Again, I spoke to MPs. Two MPs I spoke to about this, in the OBO report, and they didn't know, and they didn't seem to want to know. You ask about Black Rock, as if this, I mean, it's obvious to us that this isn't a solution, yet to them it's presented as a solution. And there are lots of winners. There are lots of winners in this whole thing. There are lots of people who are sitting there thinking, at least they're thinking that they're winners. They're thinking in some way, because, 50% of people are owner-occupiers, and many of those people think that it's working for them. And for every great councillor like Adam, there's 100 YIMBY Chris's. there's loads of them. It's extraordinary. The political realm has really been hollowed out. So the question I think one of you asked is it really a crisis? I don't think it is a crisis. It's something that they want to manage. The question for us is how, instead of trying to argue with them, instead of trying to have a conversation with Steve Reed, we need to produce the narrative, produce the argument, produce the synthesis that replaces Steve Reed. That surely is. We've got to stop trying to argue with them. We've got to stop trying to present the evidence and say, look. That's a question, believe it or not.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think it goes back to what was said at the start of the day about the government really doesn't want to do anything that would challenge landlords. That is their ideology. And in a way, we're quite blessed by how stupid they are, because they didn't realise how significant the Renters' Rights Bill was. They put that through with no knowledge of the fact that it would reduce rent inflation, that it would allow tenants to stand up to them. So they've been caught blindsided by their own legislation because they genuinely believe that 1.5 million new homes, which by the way is 7 new Manchesters, is going to bring down the cost of housing.
I mean, I agree. You can't really argue with the establishment, and there's no point in arguing with the establishment at this point. Their views on housing and landlordism and so on are extremely fixed. So it is about developing power to fight them, and that is what tenant unionism is about. That's why I talk about building really big. Everyone putting their shoulder to the wheel and growing tenant unions wherever they are, because you're not even just arguing with the ideologies of new labour or whatever. Because in fact, what you're arguing with is like a global block of capital, right? And it's not interested in being argued with. Now, of course, at a national level, you can do things to control global money and so on, but there's no will to do that. And there's a global consensus among people who govern rich countries that you shouldn't control capital. So it's about developing the power. And it's going to be quite a long road. You know, it's not going to be next year that we do it. So we just need to be building. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Isaac.
Yeah, thanks for your talks. I mean, on the rent tribunal thing, it would be really good to chat, Nick, because we're actually planning in Greater Manchester Tenants Union, picking a particular neighbourhood along with the law centre, and we're going to be basically doing a mass campaign in that neighbourhood to ensure challenges of rent rises through the new system from May. And this hopefully could be a model that other places could roll out. I guess I just wanted to offer a couple of just reflections to the room on tenants unions and growing tenants unions and what I see as some of the next things from the position of kind of being at the centre of building GMTU over the last 5 years. I mean, I think I would really agree with you, Jacob. The question of scale is absolutely key. I think if the movement's honest with itself, it's not grown to the size that is necessary. Even LIU, I think, is 5,000 members, maybe generously, 7,000. GMTU is 500 members. Like in a city of 9 million people, it's not particularly large. LIU equally, GMTU is not particularly large. But I think this question of scale is requires a sort of organising methodology that can cope with that. And I think that we're internally only now developing the proper onboarding, training, categorisation programs, and teaching of a political common sense around the necessity of organisation building that I think will allow us to scale. I think if I reflect back, like the people who set up GMTU came out of a kind of political moment, I think, around Corbyn, and this is quite similar with other tenants unions, where the necessity of organisation was seen as a real primary kind of, particularly out of 2019, this necessity to build organisation, working class organisation. But I don't think we were successful in teaching that to the people who came in, kind of the necessity of discipline within an organisation and categorisation and political education within that organisation to the people who came in. And I think what we had layers of people kind of come in, particularly kind of since the pandemic, where I think the political shift within the kind of activist left switched to a much more mobilising approach with kind of these waves of kind of street mobilisations. And I think GMTU, certainly within the Manchester activist scene, started to become a bit kind of an oddity in this focus on kind of building organisation, when I think there were these kind of repeated mobilisations around particular issues. I actually think there is a kind of switch at the moment within the kind of general left back towards this question of organisation. But I think it's really, really important that we kind of ground these questions of organisation and the methodologies of building organisation. And at the moment, we're onboarding a lot of stuff that we've learned from the Palestinian youth movement to bring that into the context of our own organisation building and kind of the methods of organisation. So that's, I think, one important thing that I think will be really important to see how that develops over the next year. And I think the second thing is resources. I think the tenants union movement is not funded by its own money. It's not funded by its own membership. LIU, is better, but there is a reliance on grant funding, and I think that this is a key weakness of the entire movement going forward, and I think we really need to get serious. I think the stuff you were saying about these kind of German movements of the early 20th century and late 19th century, that is the model, but I think just generally we are not serious enough about the necessity to basically pay our own way on the left and have our organisations pay for ourselves. And I think, the grant landscape around tenant organisation is going to change. The Nationwide Foundation, which has funded the Renters Reform Coalition, Living Rent, ourselves, is withdrawing from this space. And that is going to have impacts on the ability of these organisations to reproduce themselves. And I think there kind of needs to be a wide reckoning with this question of developing our own resources, basically. And we're going to be putting in place a big push on this from April. So I think it will be really interesting to see how these things play out over the next year. And hopefully that will be kind of stuff that other organisations, can learn from. But yeah, thanks. And your book is great for, I think, that snapshot of the moment we're in and all these, the variety of the organisations that have been created.
Thanks very much. Okay, any other questions or points?
Basically, I know you said that the right don't talk about housing, but I disagree with that, because I think the entire conversation around asylum and migration is directly they know that they're whistleblowing specifically around housing. And then I think there's also a bit that we've all missed, which speaks to Nick's point about the Civil War. I'm really worried about the Civil War. I don't think we have a large enough, as a socialist, you're looking for people to speak to people's interests, and there is about to be a civil war between everyone who is about to be part of the largest transfer of wealth in human history, housing wealth, from when the boomers die out. And that's why reform keeps talking about inheritance tax. And that inheritance tax conversation is one which I'm seeing come up on the doorstep from migrants who want to vote reform for that, because that is the solution to escaping and passing on something to their kids. And so I think we are entering this very scary point where, for those of us who are looking for housing justice, I think in the 2010s we were like, we have this coalition. It is young millennials. They are being screwed over, and there's enough of them in cities for it to have an electoral impact. And their parents care because their parents don't want them to be suffering like this. And older people broadly think social housing is older people who might be voting Tory in red wall seats all think social housing is a good thing and right to buy was pretty bad, and they understand that. But that coalition is being carved up, and I think I'd like to hear more about what strategies we avoid falling into some of the traps that the right are going to set us on this specific question during this, what Nick described as the civil war of the interest groups.
Yeah, excellent points, and I think when Against Landlord came out, there was an awful lot of loud booing from various people, but it was really important to make the argument against scarcity over and over and over again, and as loudly as possible. And that stat from Beth, about 20% more housing now than we had in that pre-crisis moment, because if you have that, then it's difficult to be a racist about housing. To debunk the idea of shortage is kind of the moral duty of the anti-racist, I think. So the more we talk about the economic causes of crisis, if it is a crisis, and less about shortage, then that's how we take on reform and people of that ilk.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I spoke a bit too glibly there. I guess what I meant to say about reform is that they don't have anything really sensible to say about housing, because of course if they really deported enough people to free up all the housing that they want to, the entire economy would collapse. So they don't have any viable solutions, but they have a lot to say, as you say, about scarcity and how scarcity is caused by migration. So of course we have to talk about how scarcity is caused by capitalism, essentially. And I think that the tricky thing here is there is kind of a need to make the argument that housing is not a simple supply and demand system, and that it's an awful lot to do with what credit is available, who that credit is available to, and so on. But that's an extremely boring economic argument, and I don't know how to sell it on the doorstep. I think I'm not entirely with Nick sometimes on the issue of how much housing needs to be built. The population of London has grown significantly in the last 20 years, and the building of housing hasn't kept up with that. I think, if you want to make the arguments for immigration, you also have to say, whenever we are getting more people in anywhere, we need to build the housing for them, the schools for them, the hospitals for them, the GPs for them. And this is the argument that, true socialists would always make, but they never really get the chance to make it in the public sphere, right? You can make this more instrumental arguments about how migrants pay tax, and that can help to pay for services. It doesn't really seem to make a dent when you do it, because people have just quite a visceral reaction to the scarcity they feel, and to the otherness of other people sometimes. I think, you know, in the end, the way to fight the far right is to end austerity in this country. It is the best way to do it. But of course, if if reform wins, then that's not going to end austerity in this country. So sometimes it does feel like a chicken and egg. There's no magic solutions to it. But of course, we have to keep making the argument that housing can be available to everyone. It was in the past, it can be again, and that politically, economically it's possible, and that there's simply political blockers rather than migrants taking all the housing, etc. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough though.
Okay.
Since we're still here, I thought I'd throw in a couple of things. One is the climate crisis, and I feel like having had all these hours of talking about housing and not really mentioning it seems a terrible omission. And the fact that we have, in England, it's just under 1 million empty homes in this country. And so the sort of supply side thing and scarcity is a nonsense. It's not true, the scarcity conversation. And also building standards and building safely and fire safety. These things also, when we're having conversations about housing, need to be front and centre in terms of our conversations. The rubbish builds that have been thrown up across London are staggering. They're disgusting. They really are disgusting, and yet people are profiting off these rubbish builds. And some of them are not even fit for people to live in when they're built. So let alone 10 years down the road. So we those things all need to be in the conversation as well.
Thanks very much. Was another? Okay.
Sorry, a few people were mentioning the scarcity thing. I just wanted to come back in with my 2 cents, because I don't think it is a complete myth, the scarcity thing. I think it's complicated. I think if you take just a total per capita number of dwellings in the UK approach, then yeah, it's marginally by point something percent less now dwellings per capita than it was, say, 20 years ago. The difference is minimal. But I think what you do have is you have a shortage of particular tenure types in particular places. So I think particularly in urban areas, what you've got is a shortage of homes. I mean, there's places around Blackburn I could show you where there are still rows of empty houses. Does that mean there isn't a housing crisis in Blackburn? No, because people in Blackburn still can't afford to live in them. But there are empty homes around. I think some of those are unnecessarily empty. But a lot of them are. It's not that they're unnecessarily empty, but they're not. A lot of them are occupying in places where there isn't a mass influx in terms of population. In fact, there's often population drain, and different parts of the country, I think, have a very different situation as regards that housing supply. So I think there is a really important point here about making building work. Granted, all of the other problems that have been raised, I think, are completely legitimate.
Okay, I'll take one more.
Hi again. I'm just kind of following up on my previous question and thinking about some of the other things that have come up about how your organizations are kind of funding themselves. right now, I think the trade unions are being very slow, but they are catching up. A lot of trade unions are now pushing on the government to sort out the housing crisis because they do see it's important. But in my union, and I know a lot of other unions, I'm leading on disaffiliation from Labour, and I know that other unions are also having this conversation. So, in the dream world that we've disaffiliated from Labour, we would have trade unions as a whole would have millions more to be spending. Would you say that trade unions providing your sorts of organisations, whether that's a law society or whether that's like renters union with additional funding to supplement for like grants and stuff, would be helpful? And if you did get additional funding from trade unions, how would you think that you would spend it? Like, how would it help your campaigns move forwards? How would it help you support more people in local areas?
Yes, give us money. But of course, it only really works if it's long term, right? It has to be a long term commitment. Getting money for a year or two allows you to employ an extra couple of people, and then you have to sack them again because you don't get the money after that. It doesn't really work. So in the end, the only sources of funding that matter are like reliable long term sources of funding. Whether the trade unions would want to do that or not, I don't know. It would probably be quite a difficult conversation. I think, yeah, probably anything less than 5 years would be a bit of a liability in a way, and really it would need to be more long term than that. But I agree that being LRU is somewhat dependent on foundation funding and stuff, and it isn't really sustainable, and it can be withdrawn. And it could be that in the end, that as some of the current funders are dropping out, that we might go to trade unions to more or less fill the gap. If we got extra money, I mean, there's always more organisers to be hired. And London is a very big place. So we could hire a lot of organisers if we had a lot of money. I think that, scaling up does involve thinking about the funding issue a lot. Just a bit in response to Isaac, I would say I have another view. I agree that we need to focus on organising in a formal way. But I also think that tenant unions have been so scared of falling into a service provider relationship, which is how a lot of people see the big trade unions, that sometimes it may inhibit growth. And actually, trade unions have always historically had a lot of members who aren't particularly active. I think trying to turn every tenant unionist into an activist is actually a way to stay small. So it's there's a balance. There has to be a lot of training up of people, but I do think we also have to be happy to just recruit loads of people who might
You need to normalise it.
Exactly.
Sympathetic homeowners will join the tenant union.
Yeah.
You can't normalise the idea that you join the tenant union only because you want to go to a meeting every single week. You've got immediate needs for rent. Apart from anything else, you're just ignoring a massive pool of potential for movement.
One of the things I've said to London Renters Union is that when people join London Renters Union, we expect them to change their whole life because they haven't previously been organisers, they haven't previously done much with their neighbours or anything, and we often just expect them to change their whole life. And sometimes they do, and they can, and it's great. But a lot of people can't or don't want to, and I think we need them as members as well.
As someone who joined LRU as a solidarity member, it was a big hassle to do it. It was a big hassle to do. It didn't really, and it felt like nobody really knew what I was doing. And I think you've really got to normalise the idea of that. Well, I've already said it. I think it's really because it's not going to be huge, but there's potentially, especially in London, there's massive anxiety. Most people are homeowners. The point One of the things about tenants organising, and it's true of organising any minority sector, at the end of the day, you can organise every single tenant in the country. You're going to lose unless half the homeowners are with you, because that's 2/3 of the people. So you've got to convince homeowners that their interests are in your interest, and give them ways of showing solidarity. I think it's really important.
Parents, maybe.
That's the number one. The number one thing to plan with people's anxiety is parents.
From the legal casework perspective, I've got close relationships with LRU and others, and the chronic and urgent problem they have is, my God, our member needs a lawyer, and there aren't any. And the reason there aren't any is because government pay rates for legal aid lawyers are the same now as they were under the John Major government in 1996. And that's not adjusted for inflation. That is the same amount of pounds and pence that the John Major government paid them in 1996. If I can add a personal gripe, due to a data hacking incident in April of last year, the government has been unable to process payment to legal aid lawyers since April. So it's a miracle that any of them are still standing at all. Into that void have stepped cowboys and claims farmers. And one of the things that unions can do, I think, is protect their members from these rip-off merchants who will really, really badly harm their lives and harm their cases. And the trade union movement historically has been very, very good at setting up sustainable structures of employment rights lawyers and personal injury lawyers. And we may be able to think of ways in which they could help with housing casework as well.
I should say it's not that hard to join LRU as a solidarity member. It's just but the membership interface is not set up. The membership interface and the membership onboarding process is all set up on the assumption that the person joining is a tenant, probably someone with an urgent problem they need the community to solve. So I don't want to be like really critical. It wasn't like, you know, it's not like I was made to feel I shouldn't be joining or something. I think we're nearly finished anyway. So, what can I ask? What union you're in?
CWU or United Token Allied Workers.
Yeah, that's interesting to know about. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. I think we're gonna finish there. It's been a really fantastic session. It's really exceeded expectations. It's all been filmed as well. We've got some quite generous funding from the university to make that possible. So, Autonomy Institute, we're kind of handling that side of things. Jack's been here all day working on it, so there will be a full record of the proceedings, and we'll hope that we'll take forward a lot of the work here in ways that we hope will be useful. We don't really know in what way at this stage, but I hope people will stay in touch and stay in contact, and we'll continue to try to build this the movement that we need. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks.